Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I'm the Writing Across Media Facilitator at Vermont Studio Center. This will be an interactive class with Christopher Castellani, whose fourth novel, Leading Men, for which he received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Guggenheim Foundation, was published by Viking in February 2019. Leading Men was featured in Publishers Weekly, People, Entertainment Weekly, Interview, and was an editor's choice of the New York Times. This collection of essays on point of view in fiction, The Art of Perspective, was published by Graywolf in 2016. Chris is on the fiction faculty of the MFA Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He lives in Boston, where he is artistic director of GrubStreet. I am thrilled to have Chris join us this morning, and I'm going to remove my spotlight and bring Chris up to the VSC virtual stage. Thanks for being here with us, Chris.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to all of you who are spending your Friday morning with me, with us together. I completely understand if you want to keep your cameras off, given that this is being recorded. But if you did want to put your cameras on, I'm very happy to see your faces. I do want this to be a somewhat interactive session in the sense that if you do have questions along the way, I hope that you will either put them in the chat, or I don't know if there's a raise hand function on this particular iteration of Zoom. But if you could let me know one way or another if you have a question, I would be happy to answer it. And I know at least one of you, hello Margaret, and I think I know a couple others, but I'm really happy to welcome any of you who I don't know, and I really hope that this session will be useful. It's extrapolated from my book of essays called The Art of Perspective, which is a kind of meditation on the craft issue of point of view, which is my kind of favorite craft element, and the craft element that I feel is the most important to get right, and the craft element that has the most transformational effect on your drafts. And I've been leading workshops for 20-something years now, and I can say with great confidence that in most cases, the manuscripts that were brought to workshop and that I've worked on with fellow writers, that the vast majority of them had point of view issues, right? Had in their revision possibilities the most transformative thing that the author could do for them was reevaluate their choice for point of view. And the problem with the current draft almost always lay in the way that the author was handling point of view. So that's why this is a topic, that's why I wrote the book. And as I say in the description, the success of any work of fiction or narrative nonfiction depends almost entirely on what I call its narrative strategy. Not only which characters tell the story, from what vantage point in the past or present, but why those choices are optimal and how they contribute to the overall effect the author is aiming for. So in this session, we'll begin by defining what I mean by narrative strategy, and then discuss its relationship to an author's choice of perspective and his or her or their manipulation of narrative distance. So we have a lot to get to, so I'm going to get to it. And I apologize to those former students of mine who are going to hear me say the things I always say. Okay, so as I said in the description, the premise of this session is that the success of any work or fiction or narrative nonfiction depends almost entirely on its narrative strategy. And by narrative strategy, people get this confused all the time. By narrative strategy, I don't just mean whether the novel or the story is in first or third person. That's always the thing that happens in workshop. It's like, oh, just change it to first or third or second, or put it in past tense or put it in present tense. And that will kind of solve the problem. And maybe that's a part of the problem, but by narrative strategy, I really mean, and I'm going to put this very brief definition also in the chat. by narrative strategy, I really mean the set of organizing principles that form and inform how the author is telling the story. I think of narrative strategy more like a blueprint with multiple kind of notes and legends and rationales and restrictions, rather than a kind of subjective or arbitrary decision. So that's the kind of mindset that we're going for here. So if you think about the word perspective, if perspective is a way of seeing something, right, then narration is simply perspective in action, right? It's perspective that's been animated in some way. It's been given a kind of life and a kind of energy, right? The narration is a reader experiencing the way in which a character or a consciousness perceives and interprets and recounts the events of a story, okay? A narrative strategy, right, is the how and the why a story is being told the way it's being told. It's the unique, I'm gonna put this in the chat as well. It's the unique philosophy behind the construction of a work of fiction that applies to that work alone. Okay? It's, for example, the type of narrator limited by age and education and experience, speaking from a particular point in time. It's all of these are included in the narrative strategy, right? It's the degree of retrospection, whether it's told from the immediate past or from the retrospective past, right? It's the level of diction, right? It's whether there are chapter headings, whether there are footnotes, whether you tell the reader what year it is at the start of each chapter, right? Whether you tell the reader who's narrating each chapter, whether you include documents. It's a choice as seemingly small as that, right? Those choices send a signal to the reader of how the author has constructed this reading experience for you. It's whether the chapters are short or long, or it's whether, as in Gone Girl or Fates and Furies or that TV show The Affair, one narrator tells one side of the story, and then his wife or husband or lover tells the other, right? It's whether, as in Garth Greenwell's novel What Belongs to You, the middle section of the novel is a 41-page paragraph that begins when the narrator finds out his father is dying. A 41-page paragraph in the dead center of the novel. The narrator can't get out of that paragraph because he can't escape this deep dive into the past in which his father lies in wait for him after finding out that he's dying. So the form in that section reflects the content. Okay? I'm just going to give you a bunch of examples of narrative strategies, right? It's Patricia Lockwood's most recent novel, ostensibly about social media, that reads like a series of tweets. Okay? It's the novel Atonement by Ian McEwan. I'm sure many of you have read that at some point. When you read that novel, Atonement, for the first time, it seems to be a fairly traditional third-person omniscient point of view, right? It's told from a controlling kind of godlike consciousness who can perceive and interpret and recount characters at will. It jumps from head to head. But when you read it the first time, you notice that it's very detailed, almost to the point of absurdity. Every candlestick of this English manor house is described. The first time I read that novel, I was so annoyed by it because why do we need to know about every single detail of this house? I found it very tedious. We get the ins and outs of a play that the child Bryony is writing and performing with her cousins. Again, I thought, this is very tedious. Why do I need to hear this? Why do I need to see the details of this child's play? I thought even a stuffy British novelist wouldn't think all this detail carried a kind of equal weight. But it's not so, but I didn't know what was going on. I assumed something else was going on. It's not until we get to the very end, and here's the spoiler, right? For those of you who haven't read it. It's not until we get to the very end of that novel that we learn that the person or consciousness that's been telling that story the whole time is not God, it's not the author, it's not an omniscient character or not an omniscient consciousness. It's Bryony herself, it's the child. She's the one who cares about the candlesticks and the ins and outs of that play. She cares because they affected her, and she cares because the book itself is a kind of literal manifestation of her guilt and her desire to recreate this lost world of the family, this kind of irretrievable world, precisely as it was. So the book is a kind of document of her atonement. And therefore, it's suffused with the way that Bryony sees the world and the way Bryony recaptures it. So when we read the book a second time, we realize it can only have been narrated by her. The way we understand everything has been through her, and therefore she herself is the story. And that's true of every single successful story that's ever been written. Every narrator becomes the story, and the story becomes them. This is what we mean when we say that when we say that the story, like The Great Gatsby, is from Nick Carraway's perspective. We mean that what really happened to the other characters is Nick Carraway's unique construction, filtered and shaped by his experience, his sensibility, his facility with language, and his insight. We only know Jay, Gatsby, and Daisy, and Myrtle, and the whole cast of characters the way Nick knows them, and how Nick wants us to see them, and because he wants us to know them, not necessarily because that's how they actually are. So in the process, Nick, as the narrator, constructs and reveals himself. So there is no purity, no essential reliability. That phrase as well, the unreliable narrator, always drives me crazy. There is no such thing as an unreliable narrator. There's no such thing as a reliable narrator. Every narrator is unreliable because they only see the world the way that they see it. And that is not always the way the world actually is. So this is as true in The Great Gatsby as it's true in your short story, in your memoir, in whatever it is that you're writing. There is only the coherence of the narrator's vision for the tale that they want to tell and the success or failure in their strategy for telling it. The reason why I said earlier that it's not enough to just change it from first person to third person or whatever, because the enemy of a narrative strategy is the arbitrary, right? Let's just arbitrarily change the tense or the point of view or the time period, right? That is a violation of any sort of strategy or logic for your book. So by that I mean, if you can't tell me right now, or if you don't know right now why your story or your novel or your memoir or your poem or whatever it is that you're writing, why it's told the way it's told, then you either don't have a narrative strategy or you're not maximizing the potential of a narrative strategy. So think about that when you're thinking about the draft that you're currently working on. Did you make a conscious decision as to why the story is being told the way it's being told? Or did you just kind of find your way in based on your gut, right? And if you did find your way in based on your gut, that's great. That's totally great. Whatever way in got you in is the right way, right? But the way in is not always the way out, right? Just because you began the story with a child's perspective doesn't mean that that's the way that's the best way to tell that story, right? We may find as we're revising that we need the child to know more than they can know, and so we have to kind of reshape that, or we need them to know less, right? Or we find that we've started really big, right? We've started with a kind of omniscient narrator, right? But that feels ultimately kind of out of proportion to a kind of maybe slice of life story that we want to tell. Or the story kind of needs the wisdom of retrospection, but we've already chosen to stick the narrator stubbornly and myopically in the first person present. So I'm going to give you a kind of real life example from my own book, which I hate to do, but it's actually, I hope, a useful example. So my third novel was called All This Talk of Love. And my original idea for the novel was that it would be about a family, that the main character would be a family. And my narrative strategy for that was to give every member of the family a kind of equal weight in the story. I actually even counted the number of pages that each family member got because I wanted to communicate to the reader that everybody's equally important. And to me, that felt like part of a sound narrative strategy. And I didn't. So, but then when readers read the book, or when my reading partner read the book, who was reading a draft, they said, "Well, I don't know where to kind of invest my heart. I don't know who is guiding me through this story, right?" And also, each of these family members had their own kind of separate storylines, and they weren't connecting with each other. So they said it felt like a collection of stories. And so the narrative strategy that I had, I thought, would actually help my ultimate goal, but the logic was off. So one important thing to remember is that just because you have a narrative strategy, just because you have an idea for how something should be organized, doesn't mean it's right, but at least you have one, right? So then you can say, okay, let me reevaluate this narrative strategy. So I then kind of decided that there needed to be one central plot through line through the novel that every character was involved in. They may have their own subplots, but there was one main plot, which is about the family returning to their homeland as their mother becomes ill. And the question of whether they're going to get back to their homeland becomes central to each character, even though they have their own storylines going on. Fine. That helped. It wasn't everything the book needed, but it helped. And then I thought that I really needed one of the characters to be privileged. I really needed one of the characters to be the kind of heart of the story. And I thought, but I wanted to do that not by giving them more pages, which is a kind of one way of doing it, one signal that a character is the main character, but not a very subtle signal. What I did was, I wanted to privilege the mother. I wanted the mother to be the central figure. And so what I did was, each of the characters in this family narrate their sections through third-person limited point of view, right? We get their name. Frankie thinks this. Prima does that, thinks that. Antonio, the father, thinks this. And when we're in their sections divided by white space, you're only in their heads, okay? Nobody else is intruding, right? We don't get anyone else's perspective, except the mother. In the sections, in each section, the only person whose consciousness you have access to is the mother. The mother can kind of, when we're in a section with the son, the mother can kind of break in and talk almost directly to the reader to tell the reader what they're thinking, what she was thinking, and what she thinks their kids are up to, right? So that sends a subtle signal. I'm not saying my book is perfect or even good, right? But I do think that this narrative strategy was successful in that it communicated to the reader that the mother's consciousness, it signaled to the reader through the mother's consciousness that she was central. And lastly, on this topic, the novel is about the mother losing her memory. The novel is in many ways about the mother losing her mind and losing herself. And so having the mother's consciousness be foregrounded also is thematically consistent with the rest of the book. So that's all the ways that is a narrative, and that is part of this blueprint, this narrative strategy for how the book would be constructed through point of view. And I also did not assign chapter. I didn't tell the reader who was narrating each chapter because I wanted the reader to do the work. That was also part of the narrative strategy. I'm going to give you one final example. Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Most of that novel consists of letters to God. And why, right? Part of that narrative strategy is that these letters are literal manifestations of her desperate quest for connection, of Celia's desperate quest for connection, recognition, and validation. But they also vividly document her voice, her level of education, in a way that they couldn't do even in a strict first person, and certainly not through third person. And the form also is a kind of echo of slave narratives. So in this case, narrative strategy gives you quite a lot, but it also restricts the book quite a lot, right? Celia is uneducated. She's severely limited in what she can say and how she can say it. So sometimes those restrictions, those limits that you put on the narrative strategy can actually be the thing that convinces you that you've chosen the right one. If you give yourself too few limits, right? If you make it so open, then you don't know what to do. You're so at sea, right? You can tell any part of the story. If you give yourself too many limits, make them too restrictive, you may not be able to fully explore the territory that you'd like to explore. Let me see. Anyone have any questions or thoughts or anything about this? So fiction writers are taught that the first pages of a novel or a story serve as a kind of contract that highly subjective readers will either accept or reject, right? So I believe that when we cast a novel aside early on, right, if we decide this novel is not for us, it's because we find something unappealing about the terms of that contract, right? We're not engaged by the voice, or the plot takes too long to rev up, or the main character doesn't compel us. The list of reasons for getting rid of a book and not continuing a book after the beginning, could fill a book of its own, right? But what is this so-called contract with the reader that everyone talks about? But the author's attempt to establish that narrative strategy, right? And what is a reader's acceptance or rejection of the contract, if not the acceptance or rejection of the strategy overall? So again, each of these craft choices is a necessary how that points to a why, and that functions as the delivery system of the storyteller's perspective. I've given you a bunch of examples of narrative strategies that work, okay? In my opinion, that work. But like Garth Greenwell and Patricia Lockwood and Alice Walker and Ian McEwan. But in no way am I suggesting that those were the only or even the most effective narrative strategies for those texts, or that a perfect delivery system exists. Like, there's no code, there's no like right way to tell your story, and you're just gonna like do some trial and error until you get to that one right thing. It's like saying there's one soulmate for everybody. No, there are probably multiple options, right? But you kind of have to find the one that does the best job to tell the story the way you want to tell it, and then move on, right? Every book we pick up is just a record of the most recent set of choices that the author made, right? We'll never know whether another route was better, right? We'll never know what the other options were, right? So I want you to take a few minutes and to think about a project that you're currently working on, and to think about whether you have a narrative strategy for it. And if you want to share it, I would love to hear about it and think about kind of case studies. But if people don't want to share that, that's totally fine, and we can move on to the kind of next part of this presentation, which is about narrative distance. I'm going to take like a 30-second break and see if anybody wants to pipe in on that.
I think if someone's not working on a project right now, I think it might also be interesting to hear what people are reading, and if this is triggering any strategies that you might be noticing, anything you're reading. Like I'm reading Memorial by Brian Washington right now, which is in 3 sections and alternates point of view between 2 different people in a relationship. And you get one person's point of view in section 1, and then I'm on reading section 2 right now with the other. It's 2 people, 2 men in a relationship, and I get one point of view in the beginning, first section, and then the second section, I get how they got together from the other person in the partnership.
And also what he does in that book too is he includes text messages, photos, things like that. And that middle section, if I remember correctly, is extremely long, right? Compared to the first part, right? It's much, much longer.
Yeah.
And that also sends a kind of signal that actually that character whose name I don't remember, unfortunately, but
It's
kind
Mike.
of, what is it, Mike?
Mike, yeah.
That it kind of is his story in the sense, right? That he's, not that the other character isn't important or whatever, but that in a way Mike's story kind of takes over, you know?
Yeah.
And I actually think, I mean, Brian Washington is it. I mean, it's a fantastic writer. His short story collection, Lot, is one of my all-time favorite stories. I actually wasn't a huge fan of Memorial. Hopefully this is recorded. I know, I'm sorry, but I mean, but
no, I'm really interested in talking about books. Like, this is my favorite thing. So yeah, keep going.
And it's mainly because I felt like there wasn't the kind of control of the narrative strategy the way that he had in those short stories, which to me were a kind of mosaic of Houston. Lot was a kind of beautiful mosaic of Houston. It all kind of fit together. Stories repeated. Like narrators repeated, and you got a kind of through line of his family, through while other stories were being told, and it ended up being super satisfying. Whereas this book, I felt like was a little bit all over the place, and I felt like the control wasn't quite there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm only in the middle section, and it is. I haven't read Lot, but I've heard very excellent, good things about it. I do find that for like the level of interiority in with these two different characters and the narration, it does feel compelling to me, and it feels really super contemporary. Yeah. And I don't know, I'm like pulled along. But I was thinking when I was reading it, I was like, are these short stories are these characters from that just got blown up like into like a larger, longer piece?
Yeah.
Which could be part of the criticism behind, or that, you know, that as intelligent readers, we're trying to pick apart how something's working. Yeah.
And again,
anyway. And how much of these hills is gold? I'm not sure if you read that.
I have not. No.
Towards the end of the book, so it's in close third person. Towards the end of the book, there's a reveal of a section with a first person speaker, and it's the ghost of the father, and it kind of annoyed me.
Yeah.
But I loved the book. I mean,
but that probably felt like a very deliberate, or did it feel like a deliberate?
Yes, I was like, oh, this is like the section where the father speaks, and it's in first person, and it was definitely like, it was a narrative strategy. It was a choice that the author made.
Right. I think we've all read books where something like that happens, and it feels like it's the author's attempt to like patch up something that they couldn't get to like the other way, so they have to kind of include it. And I've done this myself, right? I have to get this in somehow, so I'm going to have one chapter told by so and so, and that'll kind of patch it up. And to me, that's not it's not an elegant way of constructing a novel or constructing a story or a collection. And I'm always striving for a kind of elegance of structure in what I'm doing. Whether or not it's successful, I don't know. But I always feel like I want to be able to answer to somebody who says, well, why is that in there? Like, why did you make that choice versus another? And I have to have a better answer than, well, I didn't have any other way to get X, so-and-so's perspective in. Or I didn't have any other way to show what happened when they were kids. And that's not good enough, and you have to come up with an overall logic that kind of accommodates for that. And again, the way that what you start with doesn't always work. I didn't even mention that in my third book, it was the first iteration of that actually was, believe it or not, I divided up each chapter by the elements of a screenplay. So it was very strange, but it was the way, like, I kind of wrote it like a screenplay. It completely didn't work, but again, it was a way into the story for me. And I don't want anyone out there to discount how important that is. Like, whatever gets you excited to write the story that you're writing, whatever form or idea or strategy, like, inspires you and moves you to tell your story and gets you in there mucking around in it, that's the right one for that time. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one for the revision. We have to be open to almost completely reimagining it, and specifically around point of view.
Lori, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Lori?
Well, just real quick from what you said, I'm writing this book with a friend of mine, and we've gone back and forth with point of view. And the thing is, we were settling on this thing. It's an orphan story, and we were settling on one of the orphans who died, who's telling the story as a narrator. And from what you said, Christopher, I'm like really challenging that, because is that just it's a device. Why am I doing it? Why are we doing it? We need to really talk about that. It's like, yeah, she's seeing a lot of what's going on because she's dead, perhaps, but is that good enough?
Yeah. It's a perfect example, because that creates almost no restrictions, right? Because the way I would think about it is, if they're dead, they know everything, they can see everything, right? But one way to think about it is, okay, so maybe you keep that, maybe decide to keep that, but maybe there is some way you can figure out some kind of restriction on what this dead person can know or not. I don't know what that looks like. I have no idea, but because that could kind of, I really, maybe it's the Catholic in me, but I really believe in restriction, in constraints, and working within constraints, and having those be very freeing. And I've always found that when I have a character who can know everything, it actually paralyzes me as a writer. And so either take her out completely as a narrator, or come up with a way that you can put some restrictions on her. So, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? And I can move on. Okay, so we're going to look at the handout I gave you, the one that says filtered consciousness handout. And this is going to be like super, this is like very, very kind of fiction 101 here, but I think it's useful to just relook at this very, very quickly, the top part. And I'm assuming if people don't have it, they'll just let Sarah know. So as we all know, you've got the four main types of point of view. So this is specifically, this part of the talk is specifically about point of view and narrative distance. And I want to reiterate that this is part of a narrative strategy, but not the entire narrative strategy. Okay. So first person, you go along first person, second person, third person limited, third person omniscient. First person is I, second person is you, third person limited, he, she, they, third person omniscient, he, she, they, but being able to jump around to many different points of view, into many different heads, I should say, whereas third person limited is limited to one or two characters. And this little continuum I have here is, again, very reductive, but we think about first person as having the most intimacy, like you feel most connected to the first person, because first person narration, because it's like they're speaking to you. And as we move toward third person limited and then third person omniscient, the narration gets further and further away, right? And so the intimacy is lessened and there's more distance, okay? And that's all true enough, but it's not very nuanced. So I want to make it a little bit more nuanced. And to do that, I wrote this, what I call a very lame story, and it is very lame. And I know that actually, you know what? I put this together a long time ago, and I'm realizing that that's not a good word. I'm going to say a very silly story. So the first version uses a lot of what is known as filtered consciousness, and you'll see what I mean by that if you don't know. I'll read this to you. Dr. Pendergrass stood at the French doors of the living room in his new house. He looked through the panes, and there in the garden, he saw the neighbor's dog relieving himself on the hydrangea, which had just begun to bloom. It seemed to him at that moment that life would offer no end of minor insults. He noticed the wasps assembling their hive under the eave of the garage. He heard Miss Creston's trombone lessons start up next door. He wondered if moving to Bloomfield Estates had been a very big mistake. Okay. This little story is not going to win any prizes, but I want you to look specifically at the underlined phrases, right? He looked through the panes and there, he saw, it seemed to him at that moment, he heard, he wondered, okay? These are these moves called filtered consciousness. It's literally the author or the narrator filtering the consciousness, filtering the character's consciousness, right? Telling us what the character is doing in his head, right? There's nothing wrong with it, right? There's nothing craft-wise that's wrong with filtered consciousness. But what it does is it creates a distance. It creates a distance between the character, the reader, and the character. It puts the author in between, the narrator, and the author in a way, but the narrator in between the reader and the character. The author is saying, look, Chris, look at what Dr. Pendergrass is looking at, right, in third person. Okay, so if we look at a version of this story without as much filtered consciousness, and you'll see you'll see the difference. Dr. Pendergrass stood at the French doors of the living room in his new house. The neighbor's dog was relieving himself on the hydrangea, which had just begun to bloom. Life would offer no end of minor insults, he thought. Under the eave of the garage, the wasps were assembling their hive. Miss Creston's trombone lessons started up next door. Was moving to Bloomfield Estates a mistake, he asked himself. So here, the only example of filtered consciousness is he thought, right? A little gesture to the reader to remind you that we're in his head, right? But the rest of the time, we're in his head without being told we're in his head, okay? And if you look between the end of that first sentence, right? Dr. Pendergrass stood at the French doors of the living room in his new house. Between that sentence and the neighbor's dog was relieving himself on the hydrangea, which had just begun to bloom. What is happening in that little tiny little bit of white space in between the phrase new house, or the words new house, and the neighbor's dog? Somebody can just tell me what is happening in that moment narratively, or in the reader's experience.
You bring in a detail from the surrounding area, from the scene that's happening. Yeah. And it's not necessarily, the narrator notices it, but not necessarily Mr. Pendergrass. But the reader, we're invited as a reader to notice it.
Well, actually, what's happening, right, is that the reader, so Dr. Pendergrass is
looking at the dog, exactly. And now so am I.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. So he's standing. We're told he's standing at the window of his new house, and then the next line is the neighbor's dog was relieving himself on the hydrangea. What happens right there is the reader and the character fuse. Right. Yeah. We become one in that tiny little space in between house and the, right? Between that period and the. We become Dr. Pendergrass. We're now looking at the neighbor's dog relieving himself on the hydrangea. And then the next line, well, is life would offer no end of minor insults. He thought, okay, we're reminded that we're back in his head for a moment. But then the next line, under the eave of the garage, the wasps were assembling their hive. We're back identifying with Dr. Pendergrass, looking at the wasps without being told we're looking at the wasps. And so again, it's creating more intimacy in third person between the reader and the character, right? Because we're becoming them, okay? And that's great. And that's a way to create intimacy. But it's not even the most effective way to create intimacy between the reader and the character. The most effective way is through what's called free and direct style. So look at the difference in this version of the silly story, and the difference in voice that happens in third person. Okay, Dr. Pendergrass stood at the French doors of the living room in his new house. The mangy terrier Felix, Fredo, who cares, from next door was squatting like a prince over his hydrangea, which was just now flaunting its perfect azure blooms. Life had no end of minor insults, did it? First the wasp's nest under the garage eave, then that wretched Creston woman and her trombone. It was a mistake moving to Bloomfield Estates. Okay? So what's happening here is that we're infusing, in third person, we're infusing a first person like voice into a third person character, into a third person narration. Okay? The key moment is the mangy terrier, Felix Fredo, who cares, from next door, was squatting like a prince over his hydrangea. Because not in that moment, not only are we identifying with, have we become infused with Dr. Pendergrass, right? We're actually now thinking in his voice, right? The Felix Fredo, who cares, right? We're now thinking Felix Fredo, who cares, and so because of that, we're identifying even more with him. We're even closer to him than we were before. And look how the narration in third person in the rest of the piece also mirrors that voice, right? Or is consistent with that voice, flaunting its perfect azure blooms, that wretched Creston woman, the mangy terrier, without the author telling the reader what a fuss budget and what a kind of crank Dr. Pendergrast is. Without the author telling you that, and therefore creating distance between the two of you, he's, the author is showing, this is not really a show don't tell, but it is kind of a little bit like that. The author is showing through the voice and through the narration, is allowing the character to reveal himself, right? Without being told. So this is actually the work of characterization through simply a manipulation of point of view and narration. And when, again, in workshop, if you've been in workshop, you probably often hear your classmates saying, I don't know, I just wanted more from Dr. Pendergrass. I just felt like we needed more of him, right? And so what do? You write like more and more scenes with Dr. Pendergrass, but that's actually not going to get the reader closer to Dr. Pendergrass. You usually when your readers say they want more of a character, it means you're not close enough to them and you're not revealing them in a way that is that you're not maximizing that possibility in third person. And if it's already in first person, there's usually an issue. There's usually a different issue. But with third person, when people say, "I want more of them," it's usually because you're not using enough free and direct style, and you're probably using too much filtered consciousness. And again, I want to reiterate, filtered consciousness is not bad. It's not bad writing necessarily, but too much of it, too many he thoughts, he wondered, it seemed to him at that moment, he heard, he noticed, he remembered, he mused, all of those things like have a cumulative effect on a novel and a story or a memoir or whatever. And it has a cumulative distancing effect, right? And it has an authorial intrusive effect. And that is what often keeps a reader from identifying with the character. So I want to look at an actual like good story or good writing, good literature, and see how this is playing out there. So in the other handout, which I also now have to dig up here on my computer because I can never find anything, the Forster's, Howard's, and Passage to India. If you could look at that. And I apologize if I'm going too fast, but I see we're almost, we only have 13 minutes, so I want to make sure that this is clear. But in the meantime, did anybody actually have any quick questions or thoughts or concerns? Okay. Okay. So it's important to know. So these are this handout has the beginning of two different novels by the same author, right? And my goal here is to show you how point of view and narrative strategy and narrative distance are all working together to kind of set that contract with the reader from the beginning. And for the same author doing two very different things in two different books. And it goes back to what I said earlier about a narrative strategy is only good once, right? You can't just keep using the same narrative strategy over and over again. It's not portable, it's not transferable, right? It's like an expensive concert ticket. You can't transfer it to someone else, right? It has to only work. It only works for one book usually. So for Howard Zahn, this isn't the very beginning. The very beginning of the first line of that novel famously is, "One may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister," right? That's the first line of that book. One may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister, right? Immediately, you get this kind of gossipy, casual, almost off the cuff, almost impromptu sounding narration, right? And then you get a bunch of letters, right? So you get the actual letters, but there's this voice that's talking to you at the beginning. One may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister. And then we move back and forth between Helen's consciousness and her sister Margaret's consciousness. We go back and forth, limited omniscient between the two of them, right? But there's a voice the whole time who's a kind of first person sounding voice that's kind of whispering in our ear and gossiping even in between the other characters. Okay, it's very chatty and has a lot of attitude. Okay, so this is the beginning of chapter 5, and this is that same voice. Okay, it will be generally admitted that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is the most sublime noise that has ever penetrated into the ear of man. All sorts and conditions are satisfied by it. Whether you are like Mrs. Munt and tap surreptitiously when the tunes come, of course, not so as to disturb the others, or like Helen, who can see heroes and shipwrecks in the music's flood, or like Margaret, who can see only the music, or like Tibby, who is profoundly versed in counterpoint and holds the full score open on his knee, or like their cousin, Fräulein Mosbach, who remembers all the time that Beethoven is echt Deutsch, or like Fräulein Mosbach's young man, who can remember nothing but Fräulein Mosbach. In any case, the passion of your life becomes more vivid, and you are bound to admit that such a noise is cheap at 2 shillings. It is cheap even if you hear it in the Queen's Hall, the dreariest music room in London, though not as dreary as the Free Trade Hall, Manchester, and even if you sit on the extreme left of that hall so that the brass bumps at you before the rest of the orchestra arrives, it is still cheap. All right, a lot is happening in that paragraph, okay? You're getting this kind of attitude, like this kind of haughty, almost a little bit like Dr. Pendergrass, like a little bit like attitudinal, fussy kind of voice, right? And a little bit self-important, right? It will be generally admitted that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, blah, 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 right? It's consistent with the voice in the rest of the novel, right? It's that same chatty narrator, right? What can he do? He can dip into anyone's head, right? And tell us what they're thinking, right? But notice how he just kind of like falls into it, right? Whether you're like Mrs. Munt, or like Helen, who can see heroes and shipwrecks in the music's flood, or like Margaret, who can only see the music. He's kind of like floating above them, dipping in, telling us what they're seeing, right? And that has that kind of distance, right? And so that's the narrative strategy of this book, a kind of voicey, first-person-y narrator who's actually omniscient, right, and who can dip in and out. Okay, but I want to show you what happens and how deftly he handles this, because on the same page, the top of that page, if you look over, there's a paragraph that begins, "For the Andante had begun." It's just right across from where that line of Helen was underlined. Line about Helen was underlined. This is a really amazing sentence and movement that he does here. For the Andante had begun. Again, he's in this voice, right? For the Andante had begun, very beautiful, but bearing a family likeness to all the other beautiful Andantes that Beethoven had written. And to Helen's mind, rather disconnecting the heroes and shipwrecks of the first movement from the heroes and goblins of the third. She heard the tune through once, and then her attention wandered, and she gazed at the audience or the organ or the architecture. Much did she censor the attenuated cupids, blah, 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 blah. We're hearing her thoughts here. This is an example of, to me, a perfect example of using filtered consciousness, right, in a way that is elegant and necessary, right? What filtered consciousness? So the examples of filtered consciousness here is the little phrase "to Helen's mind," right? And then a little bit in the next paragraph, "she heard," right? Those are the things we just looked at in the other example, right? She heard, Helen remembered, to Helen's mind, same idea, right? But what it does here is it acts like a hinge, right, between that first part of that sentence. For the Andante had begun, very beautiful, but bearing a family likeness, blah, blah, blah. That's the narrator, right? And then within the same sentence, right, to Helen's mind, right, is the hinge, rather disconnecting the heroes and shipwrecks of the first movement from the heroes and goblins of the third. Now he switches us into Helen. And now for the rest of that paragraph, and actually the rest of the chapter, we are fully in Helen's mind. And we fuse with Helen. So much so that if you look at the bottom of that page, under where I've written E.M. Forster Howard's End, and I've made a little mark at the bottom, we've been in Helen's head the whole time, right? And then there's this line, Helen could not contradict them, for once at all events, she had felt the same and had seen the reliable walls of youth collapse. Panic and emptiness, the goblins were right. So what's happening there is that's filtered consciousness. That's her panic and emptiness, her thinking the goblins were right without him saying she thought, she said, she mused, etc. Right? And so we've fully fused with Helen there. And Helen is the heart of this novel, and her and panic and emptiness are also the heart of this novel. Those are sort of themes that go throughout. So you can see purely through, or almost purely through, or solely through point of view, there's characterization happening, and there is thematic resonance happening, mainly managed through point of view manipulation. And then very, very quickly, I promise, like 1 to 2 minutes, I want to just contrast this novel, this Howard's End, this kind of domestic novel that's ultimately about love and relationships and class, with a passage to India on the next page, which is a novel very much about kind of East and West, like very much about like colonialism and these kind of like very kind of big topics. Not that the other book topics aren't big, but these kind of historically contextualized more so topics. And the narration, the point of view, is qualitatively different in order to be consistent with the kind of thematic interest of the author here. And so, I mean, if you can, even visually, you can see, right, that it's kind of tighter, it's longer paragraphs, and it's got these like part 1, mosque, chapter 1. This actually there are no section titles in Howard's End like that, right? It has a kind of importance, it has a kind of weight, is what I'm trying to say, that the other book doesn't have. And if you look, but it also sort of has a little bit of the same narrative tone in the sort of chattiness of the narrator, but in a different, but in a heightened tone. So I'm just going to read the first couple sentences, and I think you'll see what I mean. And contrast this to "One may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister." Okay, here's the first line of passage idea. "Except for the Marabar caves, and they are 20 miles off. The city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. Edged rather than washed by the river Ganges, it trails for a couple of miles along the bank, scarcely distinguishable from the rubbish it deposits so freely. There are no bathing steps on the riverfront, as the Ganges happens not to be holy here. Indeed, there is no riverfront, and bazaars shut out the wide and shifting panorama of the stream. The streets are mean, the temples ineffective, and though a few fine houses exist, they are hidden away in gardens or down alleys whose filth deters all but the invited guest. Chandrapur was never large or beautiful, but 200 years ago it lay on the road between Upper India, then Imperial, and the sea, and the fine houses date from that period." So again, you see the sweep, you see this godlike narrator who still has a little bit more than a little bit of an attitude about what he's seeing, but is kind of literally looking down from like a height, right? And giving you geographic expansiveness, historic expansiveness, and that is highly consistent with the type of themes that the novel is addressing. And the characters in this book is the last thing I'll say before we break. The characters in this book aren't even really deeply nuanced characters compared to the characters in Howard's End. There's one female British character, Adela, and one Indian character, Dr. Aziz, who kind of like stand for East and West, or West and East, and they're kind of like more like types that the author is kind of drawing on, right? And they represent, one represents the British colonial nightmare, and the other represents India, right? And so the way that the story is told, which is my theme from the beginning, is deeply reflected in the themes that the author is getting at. So I sort of railroaded through that. I apologize for going so fast, but to me, those two novels perfectly illustrate how a narrative strategy, when it's consistent with theme, is why it's so important. So, and that's it. And we have 30 seconds for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. If there are any burning questions, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand or drop them in the chat. I think that the last thing that you said is picking your narrative strategy and then also considering whether or not it's thematically consistent is like the next level, like it's like leveling up.
Exactly. But it takes a while to figure that out. So if you don't know it from the second you start writing a draft, that does not mean that you're doing it wrong, right? It's the process of writing the draft, and the cliche, but the trial and error of it all is what leads you to the right strategy. But I think too many of us, and I put myself in this category too, too many of us are so beholden to what we started with, maybe mostly because we're lazy, right? That we're not willing to completely reimagine it or look at it more critically. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, and how that was like totally
a strategy.
Yeah, total different strategy. Yeah, and I also think that this is applicable too for me as a poet to consider, put sequencing a manuscript. And what that means for the order in which the poems are arranged.
No question.
I'm gonna apply this to my manuscript too.
All right, excellent. Our work here is done. That's awesome.
Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your brilliance and your expertise. And then I also really appreciate you sharing your own trial and error as an example. And I really value that when a fellow working writer shares their experience. So
I'm always sort of leery of doing that, but I appreciate it. And thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed my time. I hope to see you in Vermont, all of you in Vermont, before long. So.
Yeah. If you haven't already, please pick up Chris's books. And I'm going to also drop in his website. And thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, exactly.